Please welcome Doug Forum superhero and Microsoft MVP, David Musgrave. Today, he will be presenting his session on Microsoft Dynamics GP development, choosing the right tool. Please stick around after David's session for a live Q&A.
Hi and welcome. I'm glad you're able to join us. We're today doing a session on Microsoft Dynamics GP development tools and making sure you choose the right tool. My name is David Musgrave. I'm the owner and managing director of Winthrop Development Consultants. I'm a Microsoft Dynamics or Microsoft MVP for business applications. I'm also a GPUG All-Star. I've been involved with GP since about 1994 with version 2. I did spend a number of years at Microsoft, but I have got my soul back now that I left them back in 2014. I'm based in Perth, Western Australia, on the other side of the world from most of you guys. So today we're going to be covering, as I mentioned, development tools. We're going to be splitting those up into the customization tools, covering Modifier, Visual Studio, Dexterity, which is the native language of GP, also showing you what you can do with GP Power Tools, and a little bit of a discussion on service-based architecture. And then in the second half, we'll be covering some of the integration tools, including things like Table Import, Integration Manager, eConnect, and the two types of web services available. We'll also give a quick mention to some of the third-party tools that are available for importing. So we'll start with customization tools. And one of the things to think about with the different tools you've got is particularly the user designs, interface design standards. So there is in the Dexterity manuals in an appendix which actually explains the standards. But the main thing is if you're modifying a window, you want to make sure that that window, whatever changes or fields you've added, that it looks like the original window so that the end user can't tell that you've modified the window. So that means just making sure that it matches the existing fields on that window. I also like to talk a little bit about hybrid development. Sometimes the tools, individual tools, can't do everything that you need. So don't be afraid to use multiple tools to achieve your aim. You can mix and match them, use the best tool for each part of the job, and it is pretty common to actually use multiple development tools within a project. So, and since GP 2015, you have also got access to service-based architecture and the .NET Interop, which does allow you to call out to the .NET world from GP as well as call into GP with a web service. So we'll start with one that most people know, which is using Modifier and Visual Basic for applications, otherwise known as VBA. So VBA itself, it should be noted, it is end of life. And it's also not compatible with the GP web client. So if you're using a web client, any VBA customizations will not run at all. And if you're using some of the latest platforms such as Windows Server 2019 or later, VBA will not run either. So one of the things with VBA is that you really need to start looking for a way to replace it. And some of the other options I'm going to go through are your alternatives for replacing it. That said, it's a tool for power users and partner consultants. It has the ability to modify windows using the modifier component. And then using VBA, you can automate the user interface. You can add additional business rules. You can access the system dialog, so the dialog that pops up and says, do you want to save, discard, cancel? And you can answer those. It can work with reports, but it doesn't have any access to underlying business logic. So we can't see or call any of the procedures or functions or underlying code. It's very much only integrating at the user interface level. So we'll do a quick demo and show you how that all works. We'll pop into our GP session. And we're going to be modifying the customer maintenance window. And we're going to add a reason for change field to this window, and we're going to then make it save and read along with the the customer record. So to speed up the process, I have a macro recorded of the actions. Take me to the modifier and add this field. So basically, I'm going to pop in, and I will make the window. Here we go. So I'm going to make the window a little bigger, and then I'm going to move the fields down. I'll add the reason for change fields, and I will, there we go, created it, and then I'm just going to align all the fields to line them up. I will link the prompt, and okay, that's setting the tab sequence, and then we link the prompt, and we come back to GP, and we have our field already modified. So the steps there, they might take a little bit longer if you're doing them manually, but they're not that difficult to do. And I've just added a local field called reason for change and a prompt to the window. So now when I go into that window, if I was to just go back into the window, you'll notice that those fields don't appear. And that is because I haven't changed security to show that window. So to change security, I can just do that in the option to change the alternate and modified reports. What I am going to do is show you what the original window looks like. Now, I'm actually leveraging the ability of GP Power Tools to allow me to select which window. So rather than changing security, I'm just going to say open up the modified window, and now you can see I have the reason for change field on here. But at the moment, nothing's actually working, and that's because there's no business logic here. So if I pull that up, you'll see that there's no data coming in, and there's no default values showing here. So what I need to do now is add the fields to VBA. Now, I need to add the save button and the delete button to VBA, and I can't actually do that because these buttons across the top are not actually Dexterity, they are .NET. So I need to change from using the ribbons back to using standard toolbars. So you can do that under user preferences. So I'm just going to run another macro, and that'll change the security setting for user preferences. Here we go. And it's going to exit out of GP. Alright, so I'm going to need to relaunch GP, come back in, and this time when it comes back in, it'll have the old style toolbars rather than the ribbons showing, and that means that I can now click on those buttons and add them to VBA. So I'm going to add the fields I need, and I've got another macro to add the fields. So we'll be adding like the customer ID field, the actual reason for change field, the delete button, because we need to be able to pick up when they've clicked delete. Okay, so maximize this, we'll come back to customer maintenance, open up the modified window. You can see now it's got the old style toolbar, and then I can from here run the part 2 of this, which will add the actual fields. Okay, so the window itself and the fields are now being added. And finally what I will do is go back to and run the last macro, which is going to change the ribbon back to the ribbon. So that's part 3. And we're changing back to the ribbon, and that will exit again, and I come back into GP. Okay, and we launch GP again. Okay. So this time now we'll be back to ribbons, but we have actually got the fields we've added that we needed to. So that is quite a common requirement that you might have to change and get rid of the ribbons so that you can get access to the original buttons across the toolbar, and that is just a matter of going into user preferences and changing it back to the standard menu toolbars. Okay. And we're back. Okay, so if we go back to customer maintenance, open up the modified window. So now you can see we're back to the window looking like how it normally would, but if I pop into the Customize and Visual Basic Editor, okay, and we got the Visual Basic Editor here, you'll see that the customer maintenance window has been added, and I've added the ID field, the delete button, the save button, and the reason for change field. So now all I need to do is double click here, which opens up the scripts, and at the moment there's no scripts in there, so this is where I'm going to cheat. You don't need to see me type in all the scripts. I'm going to come down here and load up the scripts from Notepad, paste them in. Alright, so if we have a quick look at the scripts, you'll see that I'm using the DUOS, which is the Dynamic User Object Store, which is implemented as the SYS 90,000 table in the company database. This is a table that is easily accessible from VBA, and it allows you to store data in it so that you can then, we don't have to worry about directly accessing SQL or creating new tables. So I have events when the window first opens to set a default value. When you change a customer ID, I read in whatever value you had. So I'm going to be dealing with what we call the CRUD events. That's create, read, update, and delete. So when you've read the customer ID, we change it. When you save, I deal with the save. I deal with the delete. And we can also handle the modal dialogues that come up. So they're all the scripts for it. I will now compile it. We can pop straight back into GP and to that window, and now it's functional. So if I hit clear, you'll see reason for change, the default value is entered. If I pull up a record, you'll see it says hello to DynamicsCon, and we can put in here that was the VBA demo, save it, come back, it's all working. End of demo, and we can move on. So we'll come back to our presentation. So the second method we've got to customize GP is using the Visual Studio tools, which is an add-on for Visual Studio which allows it specifically to be able to work with GP. So it means that we're working with managed code in the .NET framework. We've got the ability to work with either C# or VB.NET. And we've got all access to anything that .NET is capable of doing. You can create new WinForms, and they sort of look like Dexterity, but they're not truly Dexterity. There's a bullet point here because one thing to note is that WinForms created with Visual Studio tools are not web compatible, so they won't show on the web client. You can create user interface events, so you can have events very similar to you can with VBA, but we do have the ability to put events and calls on the underlying business logic, so I can see and call the underlying procedures and functions. I can also access any of the tables in Dynamics or third-party, and I can do that through Visual Studio Tools and the Dexterity style interface. I don't have to use ADO.NET or SQL calls to access them direct. I can still use ADO and SQL calls if I wish, but I don't have to. It cannot easily work with the report writer reports. There is a technique where you can make custom report writer functions with Visual Studio. Okay, so the point here is that it's not web compliant with the HTML5 web client. Believe it or not, the Silverlight client, which we don't use anymore, it did support WinForms, but with only standard controls. But the current web client won't handle it. Now, if you do install Visual Studio, the templates that Microsoft provided with GP only went up to Visual Studio 2015. So if you want the templates for Visual Studio 2017 or later, please go and look at this blog by Tim Woppert, and he has published the information and and the templates. So using his blog, you can just see how you can download them and install them through Visual Studio in the store there. Okay, so we'll show you a little bit of a demo. Oh, actually, we won't show you a demo yet, because what we're going to show you is how you can use Visual Studio Tools with the window that we modified. So we're going to get rid of the VBA part and replace the code with Visual Studio. Okay, so this is this option. We can replace VBA. Doing this is web client compatible because the Visual Studio code is going to run and it doesn't have any windows, so it will work with the Dexterity forms that are created with Modifier. We do need to create an assembly using the DAG tool, which is a dictionary assembly generator, and that allows Visual Studio Tools to be able to see and reference the modified window. So we create a VST project. We put reference to the modified form DLL that we're going to create with the dictionary assembly generator, and then we can build our project, add all our code, and deploy. This method can't be used to create new windows because the modifier cannot create a new window. Okay, so now we can show you a demo. So let's pop back to our GP environment. Okay, so what I'm going to do initially is I'm going to get rid of the VBA component. So I'm going to pop into the Visual Basic Editor. Actually, I can do this easier. You'll see it disappear, but let's go back to GP and pull up the customer maintenance window. And I'm going to say on here, customize, and I'm going to remove the current window from Visual Basic. So you'll see it disappeared from Visual Basic. Let's just save that. So Visual Basic's happy. And now if I hit clear and pull up, you'll see that it's no longer functional. Okay, so let's close GP for the moment. And we'll pop into in here in the vb.net. So I'm going to run the DAG tool. So this, I'll just quickly show you the syntax. Okay, so this is the actual syntax for running the DAG tool. Is as simple as that. So this batch file actually runs the DAG tool and copies all the files to the locations that I want them to be. So I'm just going to run that. Okay, and there it's building the DAG. So the date on these guys should update in a second. Okay, so now we've got the new version of that DLL. So I'm going to open up the Visual Studio project. And in here, we've already got the project loaded. And we're going to be dealing with the same CRUD events, create, read, update, delete. Okay, so I have my references to Dynamics, to the modified forms, and to Dexterity. I have the same scripts here. So I'm registering events on the when the window opens. I'm registering events on display existing record, which is used for when a new record is shown. I'm handling save record, which is when the record is saved. And I also have scripts running before and after the delete button. So now, to handle the duos code, I have here some functions I've created which give me the ability to read the duos from the SY user object store table, which is the duos table, the SY 90,000 table, and I have the read, write, and delete events. So this is some standard code that I can use, and that allows me to work with the duos. So if I now save and build this, and give it a second, and it will say build successful. There we go. So I can actually close Visual Studio. We don't need that anymore. I can go copy, and that will copy the DLL to the add-ins folder on the GP environment, and then I can relaunch GP. So now I have the same modified window with Visual Studio code doing the business logic rather than the VBA code that was there previously. This does require you to have Visual Studio. It does require you to exit GP and copy the DLL and then relaunch GP for it to take effect. But it is one of the methods you can use to replace VBA. And you can do that with either C# or VB.NET code. So now we're in GP. Let's open up our customer maintenance and the modified window. And you'll see now, even though there's no VBA code, in fact, you can see there's no dot afterwards. The VBA code would put a dot after the name. The dot before specifies that it's modified, but there's no VBA, but the code is working. And now we can say, hey, this is not VBA anymore. This is doing it with VS Tools. And save, and come back, and you'll see it's working. Okay, so let's move to our next option. And that is writing it with Microsoft Dexterity. So Dexterity is the native language that Dynamics was actually written in. It was created first and then used to write Dynamics. It was written specifically to be able to write a business-oriented development environment that could run on multiple platforms, both at the database level and the OS level. So anything that you write in Dexterity is going to work on the web client because it is the same platform and it will be web client compatible. You can create seamless integrations. You can access any of the existing tables, functions, procedures. You can create your own tables, functions, procedures. You can only modify core Dynamics GP windows. That is one downside. It doesn't allow you to easily modify a third-party window. You can develop cross-dictionary code, so you can write code that talks to third parties, but you can't actually modify their windows with Dexterity. You've got the ability with the .NET Interop to talk to any or use any .NET resources, and we can also create service-based architecture web service calls if you want. And then we've got obviously the ability to create anything new, resources, any fields, tables, anything we need in Dexterity. So let's just go give you a demo of Dexterity. So let's pop over here, and I have a Dexterity environment, so let's load it up. And so what I've done here is I have created a version of the same window. Okay, so I opened up the Dexterity, the original window in Dexterity, and I've added reason for change to it. Okay, and I've created a local field exactly the same, and I've done all the tab sequence and linking the fields. So this is exactly the same as how the change I made to the modified window, but I've made it in Dexterity. So this is going to become an alternate window. All right, I have registered using the startup script triggers on the same events. So we have a trigger when the form opens. We have a trigger when the window opens, display existing records, save record, and then we have a table delete trigger which we can use to tell when the record has been deleted to clear up any orphans. So those scripts run the scripts here. These are the trigger handlers. I've also created the functions for read, write, and delete from the duos. So that's the code is almost identical to what you saw in Visual Studio, but just the Dexterity syntax. So this is all the code here. I'm going to say compile the dictionary. Okay, so that's all compiled. Let's close out from Dexterity. I'm going to run the utilities, which will run a macro so that the steps are easily repeatable, and it also runs quite quickly. So that has created a chunk file copying the window that we modified so that we now have an alternate window, and that gives us our CNK file. So I'm going to drop that CNK file into the live environment. I'm just going to copy it. And now if we close and relaunch GP, that chunk will extract. I've got it extracting automatically, so there we go. It appeared just for a second then. So we've now, by extracting it, it has added the dictionary to the launch file, the dynamics.set, and it is now incorporated into the GP environment. So installing automatically, you can use the auto install chunks equals true dex.ini setting. Okay, so now we're inside GP, and this time when I run customer maintenance, I would change security and tell it to run the alternate version of the window, which if I open, so you'll see there's no dots. This is not modified. This is an alternate version of the window, but the same code is running, and I can now say, hey, this is Dexterity, and save it, and you'll see that it now says Dexterity. So this is just another way of doing exactly the same thing. All right, so the other option that I want to give you is using Modifier and using that same modified window that we had from before, but using it with GP Power Tools. So basically, this is a replacement technique, again, for VBA. It is web client compatible. You use the modifier to make changes to your forms. Then you can use GP Power Tools to add the business logic instead of VBA. And we can add triggers and scripts. They're written in Dexterity, but we also have the ability to call SQL code, C# code, and VB.NET code. There is no additional deployment steps. It's active as soon as it's saved in your environment. There's no external tools needed other than GP Power Tools, which is inside your GP environment. We have the ability to work with reports, modifier added fields, modal dialogues, and this also has the ability to support calls from external URLs or SPA web services. Okay, so now what I am going to do is I am going to close GP and relaunch it. So let's do that. The reason I'm doing that is I need to get rid of the add-in DLL that we have that is the Visual Studio Code. So let's go get rid of that, because that Visual Studio Code, let's close this, needs to be removed so we can actually see it working without the Visual Studio Code. So come down to Dynamics add-ins. Let's get rid of that DLL, and then we'll relaunch GP. So once we're into GP, I have GP Power Tools installed. I'm going to go to Project Setup, and that's basically where each of your projects should be starting. It's a window which allows you to pull in all of the scripts and triggers and other resources that you would need. So I'm going to go into Project Setup, and in there I'm going to have code to handle the same CRUD events and using the same triggers as we used in the Dexterity project. So let's pop into Power Tools, Project Setup. So the customer maintenance project is my default project, so it's loaded automatically. You'll see that I have here a trigger when the window first opens. I have triggers for the read event, for the write event, and for the remove event. And if I open one of these, you'll see I am actually calling helper functions. So here's the script on display existing record, but the script itself is calling a helper function called duos_get, and I've got duos_get and I've got duos_set and delete. So those same functions that are used for talking to the duos, they're helper functions that can be called from within GP Power Tools. So I also have the customer maintenance modified form added. So let's open the form, and it says, do I want to start the triggers? I'll say yes. It says which version, so I'm going to open the modified version, and you'll see it has reason for change here. And if I come back here and I can write in this is GP Power Tools and hit save. Okay, so if I stop the project and reopen the window, so we go back to cards, sales, customer, and open the modified version of the window. Without the triggers running, you'll see that this field is not active. So you could see that was Power Tools that had added those functionality. Now, I started the project manually, but normally you'd have the project start automatically. I just don't have that in my live environment. But if I open this again, you'll see, yes, I can start the triggers and everything's working again. So, all right. So back to the slides. So you can see that you've got quite a few alternatives for customizing or choosing the right tool. You've got alternatives to move away from the VBA environment. So just a little bit of a note on service-based architecture. This allows you to create global procedures and expose them as REST or RESTful web services. They can be based by wrapping a window, as in driving the UI of a window, or you can write procedural code where it doesn't use a window and it's just writing directly to tables or reading directly from tables. It can do anything you want it to do. It does consume a license while the code is running. That's one thing to note. And you can't use the same license and log in a second time until the first one's run. In the same way that you can't log in twice to the same company as a user, this is just running like you're logging in, so you can't call a second time. So that can be resolved by using multiple logins. So just use a second login, but that means that you potentially could use 2 licenses. It's a very flexible because you can make it do anything, but it's not performant. So it runs at the same speed as GP. It is not the best method for integrating large amounts of data. It is supported, but it's not being developed any further. So, but if you want to use SBA for anything or service, any of the web services, and you can't find an endpoint, you can also create your own endpoints with GP Power Tools and write a custom web service. Okay, so integration tools. So we'll run through this fairly quick, but these are some of the options that you have for integrating data. So this is not modifying the database, or sorry, not modifying the user interface at all. This is just dropping straight into the data. So a quick thought about this is you probably need to think about what you're integrating. Is this only for initial setup, or is this something that you're going to be doing continually? Are we integrating master data, customers, vendors, or are we pulling in actual transactional data? How much data are we pulling in? Is this going to be a manual process where I start it manually, or is it going to be automated? And if it's automated, how fast does it need to happen? Can I poll every hour or every so many minutes, or does it actually have to be real time? What is the level of user who's going to be setting this up? Is it going to be a power user, or is it going to be a developer? What's the level of the user who's actually going to run the integration? Is that going to be a power user or just a normal user, or is it going to be the developer again? And then the other thing to think about is what happens if something doesn't integrate correctly. How are you handling the errors? Do you roll back? Do you continue from where it failed? There's lots of different things you need to think about. So some of the ways that you can integrate. So I'm going to put this one in here. Is you can go direct to SQL tables. However, this is the lowest level of integration, and it has no business rules validation, which means that you basically have a very high risk of corruption. The other thing to note is that GP itself does not allow null values in its tables, so you'll have to make sure that you either specify all of the columns or that the columns have default values by using the bind defaults functionality. I don't recommend you use this for inputting data because the fact is there's no business logic. But if you need to read data, just going straight to a table and reading data out of a table, not a problem. There's no access to the data dictionary here, so you can't see the nice names. So you'll get cusnum rather than customer number. This sort of method can be really fast if you want to write to it, but there are probably better methods that are a little bit safer to use. So moving on, table import. Table import is built into Dynamics GP. It's only just one step above going into tables directly. Again, there's no business logic. and no data validation. It does have the ability to add records, but it can't update any existing data. So again, because there's no business rules, it's a high risk of corruption. Most people don't even know it exists, and it's not recommended, and now that I've told you about it, forget it. Okay, I don't recommend you use it. So a great tool for initial setup and maybe for some manual integration is the Integration Manager. So this is a manual process. It gets activated by the user, and it does have multiple connectors and many endpoints, so it can get to many parts of the data. It can drive the UI, but that method is slow. But it does also have connectors which will use either directly to SQL Server, or probably the best way is going through eConnect. So I'll talk about eConnect in a second. It does have a trial license, so when you first get GP, you can use it for initial implementations. It also doesn't need development skills. It's fairly easy to use from a user interface perspective, and it does have some abilities to add scripts and make customizations to the functionality. So eConnect is probably the most common way that people get into GP. And basically, it's an API that can be called in a number of different ways, via COM, via .NET, directly via SQL, or you can use things like BizTalk, or even it can be wrapped with web services. So it includes the business logic. It has you've got a lot of endpoints, and it includes most of the core features. And the reason I say most is that there is some functionality that GP through the interface can do that eConnect doesn't support, but most of the functionality is there. It's actually implemented using stored procedures within GP, within the SQL database. And you can customize it with using either pre or post integration scripts that allow you to then add additional functionality or store additional data with the eConnect call. One thing to note, I've put a note here, is that if you are doing an upgrade, make sure you back up your pre and post scripts, because they can be lost when you do upgrades. So that way you can always re-implement them. So we have the older style SOAP-based web services. So that's using the older technology, and this is actually just wrappers for eConnect. Not all of the eConnect endpoints have been exposed, but most of them have. The installation and configuration, particularly the security part of this, is difficult and a pain to maintain. So a lot of people don't like this method. It was the only way previously. It only also supports calls from the .NET environment. So there is a better way, and if you look up on the internet, you can find Steve Endo actually recommends using ASP.NET Core and wrapping eConnect stored procedures in a RESTful web service, and that actually gives you a REST-based web service calling eConnect. So final bit then is SBA. So this is service-based architecture, which is the new technology that was added in GP 2015. And it's based on calling into a GP runtime and running dexterity procedures. So there are some endpoints that are provided. They're probably not as many as eConnect, but you can customize them with dexterity scripts, and you can also write your own. You can. One of the things is if it's using a window wrap service and there's customizations via an ISV to the window, those customizations will run. So it does use up a user license while it's running, and as I mentioned before, it's not fast. So it's flexible. I would use this if I wanted to actually do extra things like actually running processes within GP. I wouldn't use it for importing data, particularly if there's large volumes. So there are also some third-party tools. So one of the most popular is E1's Smart Connect. So I would go and have a look at that. There's also Scribe and Kingsway Soft. Dell Professional Services have their Boomi, and there's an app called Jitterbit. There's a lot more. I've only just listed a few here. So some final thoughts. Please compare and contrast the tools. Not every tool is appropriate for every job, so find the best tool and be happy to mix the tools up based on what their strengths and weaknesses are. You can achieve a lot more if you're using multiple tools, and if it works, then you've got a good solution. So if you want to find me, my name's David Musgrave, as I mentioned before. I have my blog on winthropdc.com. I'm on Twitter at winthropdc, and you're welcome to feel free to email me, david@winthropdc.com. I thank you very much for your time. If you get a chance to provide feedback, please make sure you give some positive feedback if you want more sessions like this. Maybe next year I'll do a session that I've got that's similar to this, that's focusing more on replacing VBA and some of the techniques for that. All right, so have a great rest of your day. Thank you.